To the world, Osas was a man without flaws. To himself, Osas was drowning. Osas was the man everyone wanted to be, or be with. His life was like a meticulously written script that played out perfectly on stage. At 34, he was one of the youngest regional managers at his company, known for his sharp intellect, charm, and work ethic. His colleagues spoke of him with admiration. His church praised him for his devotion to God and his generosity. Mothers prayed their daughters would bring home someone just like him. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. The bathroom light flickered, casting shadows that danced on his face, but his focus was locked on his reflection. His crisp white shirt and tailored trousers were the perfect armor for the day ahead. No one would see the war raging inside. "You're better than this," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. But the ache in his chest said otherwise. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, willing himself to believe the words. He had prayed this morning, like he always did, asking God to take away the urge, the craving that had haunted him since he was a teenager. But as much as he prayed, the problem never went away. Osas thought back to when it all started, during his days at St. Anthony's Secondary School. It wasn't deliberate, at least, that's what he told himself. A senior had passed around a glossy magazine one night in the dormitory. Osas had only taken a quick glance, but that glance turned into curiosity, then habit. It wasn't long before he was sneaking looks at magazines, and eventually, engaging in the act that had become his secret shame. Years passed, and he tried everything to stop. He went for deliverance services, fasted for weeks. Each time, he believed he'd finally conquered the habit, only to stumble again. It was like being on a hamster wheel, running endlessly but never truly moving forward. He remembered one time in his university days, he asked a powerful student pastor to pray for him before a fellowship service. After the prayer, he genuinely felt remorseful and vowed to stop it. But as the service continued properly, he saw a classmate enter into the church. She was a carefree lady that laid it bare almost all the time. She walked in looking exotic as usual in church that day. She smiled and winked at him. Immediately the urge returned with such a great force. Osas could not hold it. He couldn't even follow happenings in the service again. He hurriedly went to the fellowship toilet to satisfy his craving. He had never felt so disgusted in his life. He wished the ground would swallow him at time. "Osas," his mother's voice rang from the hallway, jolting him back to the present. "Coming, Mama," he called back, quickly splashing water on his face. His mother, Mama Yuka, had come to stay with him for a few days. She was a fiery woman in her late 60s, known for her sharp tongue and love for prayer. She was the kind of mother who saw through you, no matter how hard you tried to hide. And that scared Osas. When he stepped into the living room, she was already seated on the couch, flipping through a book of devotionals. She looked up at him and smiled. "Osas, my son, are you ready for work?" "Yes, Mama," Osas replied, forcing a smile as he adjusted his tie. He glanced at the clock on the wall, wishing he could fast forward through the day. Mama Yuka studied him with narrowed eyes. You don't look like yourself this morning. Did you sleep well?" "Of course, Mama. Just a lot on my mind with work and all." She placed the devotional aside and folded her arms. "Osas, don't lie to me. You know I raised you better than that." Osas sighed and walked to the door, pretending to check his briefcase. "I'm fine, Mama. Really. Let me head to the office now before Lagos traffic turns into something else." His mother didn't push further, but her eyes lingered on him as he left the house. Osas arrived at his office, the sleek glass doors of Eno Global Consulting reflecting his polished appearance. As he stepped into the open-plan workspace, his assistant, Lady, greeted him. "Good morning, sir," Lady said with his usual energy. "You have a meeting with the regional directors at 10 a.m., and Mrs. Adeoye has confirmed the proposal presentation for noon." "Thank you, Lady," Osas replied, taking the notes handed to him. He walked into his corner office and shut the door behind him. The moment he was alone, the weight returned. The whispers of temptation crept back, reminding him of his nightly failures. It was like a shadow that followed him everywhere, refusing to let him bask in the light of his achievements. He slumped into his chair and opened his laptop, but instead of diving into his work, his fingers hovered over the keyboard. The thought of his recent relapse haunted him. He had promised himself and God that he would stop. But last night, when everyone was asleep, he had given in again. The knock on the door startled him. "Come in," he said, quickly straightening his posture. The door opened, and in walked someone who would change his life forever. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, her hair pulled back in a bun, and her smile brightened the room. "Good morning, sir," she began, her voice confident yet soft. "I'm here about the client inquiry." Osas blinked, momentarily speechless. She was stunning, but it wasn't just her beauty that caught his attention, it was the way she carried herself. There was an air of confidence and kindness about her. "Ah, yes. Please have a seat," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. As she settled in, she introduced herself. "My name is Ina Williams. I'm here on behalf of Odimi Pharmaceuticals. We're looking to partner with your team for a new project." Osas found himself nodding as she spoke, though his mind wandered. There was something magnetic about her presence. Her passion for her work, her intelligence, it all intrigued him. By the time their meeting ended, Osas realized he hadn't thought about his struggles for the entire hour. As she stood to leave, she smiled again. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Yuka. I look forward to working with you." He stood as well, feeling a strange mix of relief and excitement. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Williams." When she left, Osas sat back down, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. That evening, back at home, Osas replayed the encounter in his mind. As he helped his mother prepare dinner, she noticed his unusually cheerful mood. "Osas, what happened today?" she asked, eyeing him curiously. "Nothing, Mama," he said, stirring the pot of a goosey soup. You're smiling like someone who just won a jackpot." Osas chuckled. "Let's just say it was a good day at work." "Good day, eh?" "May God make it better," she replied, then added, "Osas, you're not getting any younger. It's time you settled down. How long do you plan to live alone like this?" The comment hit a nerve, but he masked it with another chuckle. "Mama, is this dinner or a lecture?" "It's both, my son," she said firmly. "You know I'm right. A wife will bring you peace and keep you grounded." Osas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stirred the soup and stared into the pot as if searching for answers in its bubbling surface. Could Mama be right? Could marriage truly help him overcome the struggle he'd hidden for so long? He didn't know, but he couldn't deny that, for the first time in years, he was considering it. Osas couldn't get Eno out of his mind. The way she had spoken with such confidence, her intelligence shining through every word, it was different. He had met beautiful women before, but there was something deeper about her, something captivating. For the first time in years, the idea of opening his heart to someone didn't seem so impossible. At work, he found himself anticipating their next interaction. And when the opportunity came a few days later, an email she sent requesting a follow-up meeting, he replied within minutes, surprising even himself with how quickly he cleared his schedule. The second meeting was as engaging as the first. Eno was professional, poised, and remarkably insightful. But beyond work, there was a lightheartedness in their conversation. They teased each other about Lagos traffic, joked about their favorite Nigerian dishes, and even shared stories from their childhood. At the end of the meeting, Osas hesitated before speaking. "Miss Williams, would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" Eno tilted her head slightly, a playful smile forming. "Are you sure this is part of the client relationship process, Mr. Yuka?" Osas chuckled, feeling a rare sense of nervousness. "Let's just say I believe in strengthening partnerships on all fronts." She laughed softly, her eyes twinkling. "All right, dinner it is." Their first date was everything Osas didn't know he needed. They met at a quiet restaurant in Victoria Island, where the atmosphere was cozy and intimate. Eno arrived in a simple yet elegant Ankara dress, her natural beauty effortlessly shining through. Over plates of jollof rice and grilled fish, they talked about their lives, their dreams, and their faith. Osas found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. He shared his passion for mentoring young professionals and his desire to make a lasting impact in his field. Eno, in turn, spoke of her dedication to her career and her dream of starting a foundation for underprivileged children. "I admire your heart. Osas said after a pause, his voice sincere. And I admire your honesty, Eno replied, meeting his gaze. For the first time in years, Osas felt seen, not as the flawless man everyone assumed he was, but as someone real, someone worthy of love despite his imperfections. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Eno's presence in his life felt like a breath of fresh air. She challenged him, inspired him, and made him laugh in a way he hadn't in years. But despite his growing feelings for her, Osas's secret continued to haunt him. The late-night struggles, the shameful moments in the solitude of his home, they didn't stop. If anything, the guilt grew heavier with each passing day. He wrestled with the idea of telling Eno the truth. Would she understand? Would she see him as a fraud? Or worse, would she leave him? One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of her apartment, Eno turned to him with a curious look. You know, she began, for someone so successful and composed, you have this vulnerability about you. It's like there's something you're carrying. Osas froze, the words hitting closer to home than she could have imagined. I don't mean to pry, she added quickly, sensing his discomfort. I want you to know you can talk to me. About anything. He looked away, staring out at the city lights. For a moment, he considered telling her everything. But the words wouldn't come. Thank you, Eno, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll remember that. A few months later, Osas proposed. It was a simple yet heartfelt moment under the starry sky at a private beach. Eno said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down her face as she embraced him. For Osas, it was a bittersweet moment. He was overjoyed to be marrying the woman of his dreams, but the shadow of his addiction loomed over him. He convinced himself that marriage would be the solution. Once he had a wife, the cravings would disappear, and he could finally live the life he had always wanted. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Their wedding was a grand celebration filled with love, laughter, and the prayers of family and friends. As the festivities wound down and they retired to their hotel suite, Osas couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and dread. Eno was radiant, her smile lighting up the room as she walked toward him. But when the moment came for them to consummate their marriage, Osas struggled. He blamed it on exhaustion from the long day, but the truth was far more complex. Years of indulging in his secret habit had warped his ability to connect intimately. Eno, ever understanding, didn't push him. It's okay, she said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. We've waited this long. We can wait a little longer. Osas nodded, grateful for her patience but consumed by a deep sense of failure. He promised himself, again, that this would be the last time his addiction interfered with his life. But promises, he knew, were easier made than kept. The early days of Osas and Eno's marriage were filled with joy and new beginnings. They prayed together, laughed over small misunderstandings, and dreamt about the future. To outsiders, they were the perfect couple, a match made in heaven. But beneath the surface, the cracks began to show. At first, Eno dismissed Osas's reluctance to be intimate as work stress. He often came home late, citing deadlines and meetings, and she believed him. But as weeks turned into months, she couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. One evening, as they sat at the dining table, Eno decided to address it. Osas, is everything okay? She asked, her tone careful but concerned. He looked up from his plate, startled by the question. Of course. Why do you ask? She hesitated, searching for the right words. You've been distant. I feel like there's a wall between us. I want to help, but I don't know how. Osas forced a smile. There's nothing wrong, Eno. Work has just been hectic lately. I'll try to do better, I promise. She nodded, but her heart felt heavy. She wanted to believe him, but something didn't sit right. Over time, the situation worsened. Osas became more withdrawn, and Eno's patience wore thin. She noticed he avoided her touch, and when she tried to initiate intimacy, he would gently push her away, offering vague excuses. She thought he might be cheating, so she planned to pick his phone and catch him. After a hearty meal one day, she grabbed his phone and went through it quickly before he came back from having a bath. She searched and searched, but could not find anything that looked like he was cheating. But then why was her husband so distant, she asked herself? One night, after another failed attempt to connect with her husband, Eno broke down. Osas, what is going on? She demanded, tears streaming down her face. Do you even love me? Or did you marry me out of obligation? Her words hit Osas like a thunderclap. He stood frozen, unable to meet her eyes. I love you, Eno, he stammered. It's not you. It's what? She pressed, her voice trembling. Talk to me, Osas. I'm your wife. If something is wrong, I deserve to know. But he couldn't bring himself to say the words. Instead, he muttered another apology and retreated to the guest room, leaving Eno alone with her tears. The turning point came one fateful night. It was past midnight, and Eno woke up to find Osas missing from their bed. Worried, she got up to look for him, thinking he might be working late in the study. As she approached the guest room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Quietly, she peeked inside and froze. There he was, her husband, sitting in front of a screen, engaged in an act she couldn't comprehend. The sight of him shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces. Osas, she screamed, stepping into the room. Osas jumped, scrambling to hide the evidence, but it was too late. Eno stood there, her face a mix of shock, hurt, and anger. Eno, I can explain, he began, but she cut him off. Explain what? She cried, her voice breaking. That this is what you've been doing while I've been blaming myself for our problems? How long has this been going on? Osas sank to the floor, his head in his hands. I'm sorry, he whispered. I've been struggling with this for years, since I was a teenager. I thought marriage would fix it, but it didn't. Eno stared at him, her mind racing. She felt betrayed, angry and helpless all at once. But beneath the storm of emotions was a glimmer of compassion. Why didn't you tell me? She asked softly, tears streaming down her face. Why did you let this fester in secret? I was ashamed, Osas admitted. I didn't want you to see me as weak. I've tried to stop so many times, but I always fall back. I don't know how to escape this. The next day, Eno reached out to a trusted friend who recommended a Christian therapist specializing in addiction. Reluctantly, Osas agreed to attend. Their first session with Dr. Abiola, a calm and empathetic man in his late 50s, was a revelation. This is not the end of your story, Osas, Dr. Abiola said after listening to his confession. Addiction thrives in secrecy and shame, but now that you've brought it into the light, you can begin to heal. The therapist introduced them to a recovery plan that combined practical steps, counseling, and spiritual practices. He encouraged Osas to create accountability systems, reduce triggers, and immerse himself in scripture and prayer. Dr. Abiola also emphasized the importance of Eno's support. Healing is a journey, not an event. It will take time, but with God's help and your wife's encouragement, you can overcome this. For the first time, Osas felt a glimmer of hope. The weeks that followed were tough, but Osas committed himself to the process. He opened up fully to Eno, sharing his struggles, his fears, and his hopes. Their honesty brought them closer, and their marriage began to heal. They fasted together, prayed together, and celebrated small victories. Eno became Osas's biggest cheerleader, reminding him of his progress whenever he felt discouraged. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Osas turned to her with tears in his eyes. Thank you, Eno, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't deserve you, but I'm so grateful for you. You're my husband, she replied, holding his hand. We'll get through this together. And they did. Months later, Osas stood before a small group of young men at his church, sharing his testimony. He spoke of his struggles, his failures, and the grace that had carried him through. If you're battling addiction, don't do it alone, he said, his voice steady. There's no shame in seeking help. God's love is bigger than your darkest secret, and with Him, freedom is possible. As Eno watched from the back of the room, her heart swelled with pride. Osas was no longer the man bound by shame and secrecy. He was a man redeemed, a man transformed, and a man determined to help others find the same freedom. Their story was far from perfect, but it was a story of hope, and that was more than enough. If you're reading this and battling an addiction, whether it's similar to Osas' struggle or something entirely different, know this: you are not alone. There are countless others who have walked the road you're on, feeling the weight of shame, the fear of judgment, and the despair of failure. Many, like Osas, believed they could never overcome, but they did. And you can too. Your addiction does not define you. In Christ, you are not judged or condemned. You are loved beyond measure. Jesus knew every weakness you would face long before you were born, and he still chose to die for you. His sacrifice wasn't for the perfect, it was for the broken, the weary, and the burdened. Do not let your struggle isolate you or make you believe that you are unworthy of love and restoration. Depression and detachment are the tools of the enemy to keep you bound. But the truth is that God is ever ready to pull you out of the pit. His arms are open wide, waiting for you to run to him. Healing begins with one step, accepting his help. Seek support from trusted friends, family, or professionals. Be honest about your struggle, and remember that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but of courage. There is hope for you. There is freedom for you. Just as Osas found a new beginning, so can you. With God's love, the support of those around you, and your willingness to persevere, you can overcome. Jesus loves you deeply, and his grace is sufficient for every moment of weakness. Trust him, lean on him, and let him guide you to the abundant life he has promised. You are not your past. You are a beloved child of God with a future filled with hope and purpose. Your story isn't over, it's just beginning. Take that first step today.